I would like to begin. There may or may not be others joining us. There have a couple that said they were not able to make it, this being August, and however have asked for the slides afterwards. So we are recording. Hopefully you're all okay with that fact. And though you've had the information on Ron, there's a fascinating background. And let me just share a couple of the things that Ron Green practices the art of developing holistic cross-discipline curriculum for diverse learners, which in itself to me is fascinating. Holds a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. Ron has taught professionally and internationally at all ages and grade levels, from early childhood to higher education. Since initiating his career as an educator, teaching theater arts and outdoor education, Ron is focused on multilingual environments, literacy development, cultural and environmental sustainability, horticulture, and natural play. And that I want to learn much, much more about and hope to learn what natural play is. And the rest of his bio is, you have it in your email, and if not, I can be happy to send it to you. Quite frankly, we don't want to hear any more from me. Let's hear from Ron.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jim. I'm going to pop into my presentation here. This is what we all came for tonight, promoting mindfulness. I will talk about it through ethics, and specifically through the way that Epic Ethics promotes it. However, the real background of why we do that, I think, is the interesting piece of what I hope to be able to promote tonight. Our language provides us with a way of being. There's a really fascinating gentleman named Wade Davis. He is an anthropologist and has worked for National Geographic for years and years and years. He's got some great TED Talks that I highly suggest. They're incredibly dense. It's like 20 minutes of dense learning, but it is worth it. So he really talks about the idea of a language being establishing an ethos and a way of being. And one way of being is not necessarily the same as another way of being. That being said, our way of being is also limited by our language, and that our language doesn't do, one language doesn't do everything that another language does or can do. And a very brief example of that is say the Bree culture of Mesoamerica, the way that they identify adjectives rather than we all know the use of gender pronouns like waitress, waiter, different ways that we augment using prefixes or suffixes, different nouns. Well, in the Bree culture, everything is kind of defined by whether it's essentially round, whether it's square, or whether it's human. And the way that the ethos behind this is kind of boiled down into, if it has round edges, it's divine in nature. If it has square edges, it's base or banal in nature, and probably made by humans. And then if it's related to the human body or in such a way, then those have a different, those are broken up differently. And so that really establishes a way of being that they walk through the world that's very difficult for people that don't speak that language to understand. We can learn new ways of being by learning new languages. And one of the most interesting parts of that are learning the words or ideas or concepts that cannot be translated. So regarding the idea of mindfulness, the way it's typically seen in our culture today, the way it's promoted, is this. They don't call it an appropriation from an Eastern philosophy. but it's definitely sold as this Eastern idea that's being brought into the West. And tonight, what I'll talk about is how that's not necessarily true. That the West has an intense and very very rich history of mindfulness that I think is kind of eclipsed in the way that we think about mindfulness today. And from those two perspectives, sati, which is the name for mindfulness, and Pali, which is the Buddhist historical tradition of mindfulness, actually does not equal the concept of mindfulness in the way that we talk about it in English. And that's because we're in English bringing that rich, diverse perspective from our cultural and historic past into play. So I want to talk about what is mindfulness. The way that mindfulness is not a new category. It's not a new word. It's deeply rooted in Old English and this idea of being mindful or recollecting, being thoughtful. The important part of this is not only the having knowledge, but also using that knowledge and its connection to mind or memory. The Norse have their name for that is Munin. If you today's Thursday, it's Thor's Day from the Norse tradition. And yesterday was Woden's Day or Odin, and he had two ravens that every day would fly off into the world and bring him back all of the knowledge of what's happening in the world, and they would land on his shoulders. And the two ravens were named Hugins and Munins. Munins was memory, and Hugins was thought and memory. And so we're sort of building up this idea that this is the way that we consider mindfulness really does have this deep cultural history with it. What's the difference between mind and brain? We tend to sometimes superimpose those ideas from one or the other. But when we look at the concept of mind, it's in its oldest form, it's really connected to memory. So mindfulness would be the use or the enactment, purposeful enactment, conscious enactment of your memory. Everything that you have from a phenomenological perspective that makes you would be used on purpose in the moment. And that doesn't necessarily negate the Eastern tradition of being conscious in the moment, but it definitely is nuanced, slightly different. Now, the oldest forms of the Pali version of the word is actually linked to Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is linked to Proto-Indo-European, and Proto-Indo-European is also where we get that root men. So while we think of these things in East versus West right now, in a distant past, those were connected. We could think of it as a whole big circle, right? That we had these divergences and different cultures grew out of those experiences and those ideas and created different languages and derivatives of those. But to really dial in this the connective tissue of the language to what our concepts now are and why we behave the way that we do, because it's at the root of a lot of it. So that mind versus brain separation is conceptual. We sometimes superimpose them, but when we think about mind, we're thinking about the concept is much bigger than that concrete thing. I'm a language fanatic, and so when I think about a concept, I'm like, well, where does it appear in our language? English contains over 440 mind-based idioms, and so that in and of itself, coming from a background of trying to teach English as a second language to English language learners, idioms are the most difficult aspect of a language to teach because they are these kernels of these expressive kernels of metaphors that are very rich and deeply culturally rooted. So when we start to unpack the idea of mind, it's important to consider all of the facets of how we take mind. That mind doesn't just go away, and then we have this new concept of mindfulness. That actually mindfulness, because we're using the word mind, we're actually bringing all of this information. It's also showing up at the door with that new concept. And it's almost impossible to generate a new idea if you're so deeply connected to something that is so rich and so old and so ubiquitous in our society. So the challenges with interpreting, and there are challenges with it, with sort of accepting an Eastern concept in practice today, really makes sense because we just use the Eastern word, which would have been a kind of a better way to do it, is just use that concept and then try to make a space for it within our culture. We didn't do that. We're already heavily into marketing what mindfulness is. But when we look at the idea of mind from an English or from a Western perspective, we're really talking about a cross-referencing or use of multiple different layers of brainwaves, as opposed to the meditative state, which is the way it's kind of sold today, is that mindfulness is often a deep, intentional meditative experience, which would be putting us in that mid-range or that alpha state, where we're relaxed, we're reflective. We have an opportunity to process things, to consider things. And we're being asked in many of the modern apps and to sit, to slow down, to intentionally breathe, which is to move back out of these more intentional brain states, right? That the beta brain state is what we consider the learning brain state, the part where you're awake, you're conscious, you're thinking. It's also the part where you're listening. So when we think of active listening, that's a beta state, not an alpha state. In fact, if I'm a teacher in school, and everyone's been here, I'm sure, but if a teacher is asking someone to pay attention, what they're doing is saying, please remove yourself from the alpha brain state and join us in the beta brain state. And we see from a cultural context right now that even artifacts like cell phones or other devices may look like distractions. They are distractions. They're a different place that the beta brainwave is being allocated, and many teachers find that very challenging in their classroom. Many presenters may find it challenging when they are looking at their audience and they see some people moving their attention to off topic or to a different place. When we ask a question and we're getting a response, then we're asking our audience to move to that gamma brain state. So that's where the language is happening. It's a synthesis of all of that information at the same time. I will, what I argue is that the Western version of mindfulness is really a working in concert of alpha, beta, and gamma. It's moving back and forth. It's saying that there's a time to listen, there's a time to express yourself, move into gamma, and there's a time to remove yourself and to process, right? To move into alpha and process, to really reflect, recollect To remind is to revisit. And we have all these idioms that are actually telling us that this is happening. And we use those idioms when we're interacting with our family, with our friends, with our culture on a constant basis. So the Western version of mindfulness is very, very sophisticated, and in ways that I think it's not wholly appreciated by the current state of the way that corporate, for example, corporate or institutional mindfulness programs are aimed at developing a relationship with this practice, with a meditative or reflective practice that tends to be more alpha. So as I said, that gamma is language, the beta is listening, learning. The times when we identify when a student is in an active learning moment, they are in that beta brain state. Processing and reflection is absolutely important. It's important for allowing our subconscious to digest things. It's also the state of pure acceptance. So rather than listening, it's actually more of an absorptive place. And this is why when we watch television or we're in an active state of maybe listening to music, we move naturally into that alpha state. Big business knows that we do this, and we have successful, decades of successful marketing around understanding exactly how these brainwaves work, how to then move into a suggestive or generative state, which is theta, and then that delta state down below is rehabilitative. But when we cross-reference these with those idioms that we were talking about, what we really get to is that the idea of the Western idea of mindfulness is intention. It's being intentional about where we go with our thoughts or where we go with our actions, how we step in this world, whether that be gardening or whether that be engagement in a deeply challenging relationship at work or political entities. It helps to understand what our language is doing within our actions and our methodology without us even knowing. We do have some idioms like peace of mind or repose that touch on that alpha state. So it's not that we're wholly in that gamma and beta wave brain states, but we tend to look across the whole spectrum for getting an accurate concept of what that means to us in our Western literature and history. In the East, mindfulness is geared toward the well-being of others. This is really where where I want to focus some of the intention of tonight's talk, is that this idea of in the East, the idea of mindfulness, what we're taking is geared not only to the well-being of others, it's responding to that collectivist society, but it's also trying to move towards kindness and compassion practice rather than egocentrism, right? The philosophical conceit, and I'll touch on this again in a moment, is that suffering is inevitable and mindfulness can help us take care of each other. In the West, mindfulness has become increasingly stripped of that. And I would say a lot of this isn't really intentionally to strip it of those ideas. It's because in the West we have a different culture, and we also have this rich history of the use of the word mind and the intention of mindfulness. So Uh, the philosophical conceit in the West is that suffering is to be overcome, and mindfulness is a self-help tool. That's the way it's used in and promoted within a corporate structure or a consumerist model, right? Why is this important? Well, according to National Business Group, in 2018, 52% of the businesses, these are big businesses, taught mindfulness practices to employees. This is huge. This is huge in the world of Western business. It's like so we've identified a tool. Why is this important? It's there. These practices are brought to corporations to specifically to reduce stress, improve team prioritization, boosting working memory, improving focus, improves creativity. All of those things are true from that meditative practice. And what we get is a return on investment. So this is specifically from Aetna, saying that they have shown a 28% reduction in stress levels, 20% improvement in sleep quality, 19% reduction in pain. These correspond to reducing the amount of time that people spent in a health care related situation. So it's saving healthcare costs. It's improving productivity at the workplace. They boiled it down to a savings of $3,000 per year. So there's a real tangible reason and purpose that mindfulness is being used in the workplace, and that's specifically to increase productivity. And I think that this is important to know and understand, because the way that it's, if we go back to that idea of, well, if our intention is to become more compassionate, how does what do we need to know about the practices that we're engaging in? Now, we may be better off in the long run, no matter what, and that's okay. But from a teacher's perspective, from a curriculum development perspective, from a person who's dealing with young kids and saying, okay, in what ways should we engage in relationships with each other, and that are going to build a force towards peace? Then I want to be aware of this, because some of it is a little bit co-opting in some ways. There's this great designer. She's actually an architect, Yang Liu, who has put together this book. You can pick it up on Amazon. It's called East Meets West, and she goes through a series of frames like this that discuss the differences in cultural concept between the East and the West. The blue represents the West, and how visually how we in the West engage in towards certain concepts. And the red side is the East. This is important, but when I work with mentors and I do mentor training, there's we will inevitably get to a point where we talk about cross-cultural referencing, and there's a few great tools out there on how to understand different cultures, understanding that those differences are really linked to the way back to that way of being that's created by their language, but that's also really refined by the political and institutional structures that run their culture, just like they are in the West. It doesn't matter where you're at in the world. The ethos of the culture also has a way that it wants to be governed, and it has people that govern it in a way that wants to perpetuate what is important to them. So this just very visually glancing at these ideas, we can see that pulling in a concept from another culture, applying it to our own culture, is maybe not as easy as simply referencing it to a word that already exists in our culture, and then having that play out as if it's as if that word they were going to work out exactly how it was intended, and it's not. But there are many reasons for that. So getting back to this idea of the problem with mindfulness is really related back to the philosophical conceit that both of our cultures deal with. There's a great author, his name is Christopher Bache, who has studied the difference between cultures that believe in reincarnation versus cultures that don't believe in reincarnation. And at the center of this is very much that rooted in that idea of like what philosophically is important in our culture. The philosophical conceit of the East, the idea of suffering is inevitable, is also linked to the idea that we're coming back, right? In some fashion, we're coming back. In the West, suffering is to be overcome within, we could also say within the life that you have, because reincarnation isn't typically, it's not across the board, but isn't typically something that Western cultures believe in, and coming from a Judeo-Christian background, right? So those two ideas present a completely different way of the way that people step in the world. A person who believes in reincarnation is more likely to take pause, to think about what they're going to do today and how that's going to not only affect themselves in the next life, but their kin and offspring in the world in the future. In the West, if we're in this for one shot, we've got one shot, then the hyper consumerism that we engage in, the obsession with happiness, with overcoming suffering, tends to be what you get, right? Is make yourself as comfortable as possible within this life, because this is all you have. And that I think is an extremely important aspect of how we engage in mindfulness, and how we say, is it possible to resurrect or to intentionally use the Western notion of mindfulness to maybe get at this idea of taking care of each other? That would be an impressive marriage. Like, where could we go with this? How do we marry those two concepts? Because we will anyway. We already see this market cross-pollination of cultures. We call it a global economy. So we're already there in practice. And how do we do that intentionally within our relationships on a daily basis? So as I mentioned, political entities, business entities have evolved very sophisticated methods of success within the respective of their respective cultural ethos. So depending on what you get, and the language that you're working with, how do we continue to evolve that culture within those parameters? In the West, we've built an ethos of mindfulness just as sophisticated as the East. And at the core of that ethos is this idea that questions that invite dialogue, critical thinking, and reflection are the basis of what we might consider mindfulness. So it's working across those different brain wave states. So with epic ethics and with Rotary, this is, before I was ever called to to participate in epic ethics, the Rotary 4-way test was really amazing to me. It's amazing because it doesn't tell people what to do. It's 4 questions that ask you what you think you should do, and that can be applied across the board to any situation. It's an incredibly sophisticated set of 4 questions, and the more that I've worked with it, really the more respect I've gained over the course of the last several years. I've always appreciated as a Rotarian, but watching what it's able to contribute towards the meaningful interaction between learners, between adults and learners in the situation, because when we use this intentionally in a closed system, whether it's at the high school level, whether it's at the college level, whether it's at our workplace, we're really we have 4 questions that are split between 2 completely diametrically opposed ideas, but they complement each other, right? So the deontological, or the principle of virtue, are the first 2, and people and religions and cultures and traditions that tend to be more concrete, or we might even sometimes we use the word fundamental, like fundamentalist, unbending. Those tend to be deontological, like principle of virtue based philosophical and religious ideas. Teleological, on the other side, are abstract. And so it's more based on the principle of outcome, or what are the consequences of our engagement. And for Herb Taylor, the gentleman who kind of worked these 4 questions out for his company, and then they were later adopted by Rotary. I can't understate how brilliant this is, because the use of the 4 questions together really force us to not stay in a place of that's overly concrete or overly abstract. It helps us balance out that decision making, and it's as Rotary and has been adopted and successfully all over the world. It's the presence of mind that Herb Taylor had in making sure that none of these questions conflicted with major religious philosophies, and was also part of the brilliance of it. I have a blue jay that I adopted, but now he's getting loud, so I have to shut my door. he's like, I'm hungry. I'm teaching him to eat Japanese beetles, which is fantastic. So in Apologetics, part of the big change that we made that is the part that contributes to the uniqueness of the program, and reinforces it as being a totally one of a kind curriculum that's offered around the world, is the idea of an open-ended question pool. So what we do is try to expand on those 4 questions and try to add context to that. When we ask a question, one can only respond if they're listening. As soon as they respond, they're in the gamma wave state, and when they're listening to someone else, and particularly if they're listening to someone else say something that's challenging to what their belief structure is, they can move into that state of repose or that state of reflection, and be in a place that we call cognitive dissonance, right? That's actually what we're trying to strive for, is we want intentional conflict. We want people to be challenged by having to create a space for something that they may otherwise reject wholesale, right? And by developing the practice of that, we're developing that practice that leads towards peace building. Being able to accept 2 conflicting ideas and say that there's an opportunity to provide space for both of those to exist, even though they may be in conflict. We do this in families all the time. You can't be in a family without being in situations where you have conflicting intentions, sometimes conflicting moralities and objectives. but but when we practice that in healthy ways that actually give everyone voice, then we're really exercising the practice of building empathy and compassion and also autonomous self-awareness, right? We're saying it's okay to be angry. It's totally okay to be angry, and can we hear about your anger? Can you tell us what that experience is so that we can learn from it? So we really look at the idea of open-ended critical thinking style questions as being the basis for Western mindfulness, and the Epic Ethics Protocol tries to move the students and teacher, because the teacher is a partner, it's a participant in that state, through questions that tend to ask more self-reflective questions in the beginning. So questions that maybe move us into that alpha state, and then the second set of questions tends to move us out of that alpha state into a beta state. Well, okay, now if you have to make decisions based on it, and we associate those decisions with meaningful relationships, relevant relationships, what does that look like? And then even greater expansion into a global awareness with our third set of questions. So we're always trying to move from inside to out when we do that with Epic Ethics. We also use fables, folktales, and fairy tales. We do this intentionally because these are distilled human experience narratives, and they present timeless ethical dilemmas, particularly that are global, that come from that global experience. And while we can't maybe learn every single language in the world, 6,500 that are left, we are able to maybe glean something intangible or less tangible from a fable or a folktale or a fairy tale that's been handed down and passed down from generation to generation to generation. For example, there's a coyote story that I love to tell about a coyote who is walking along and the salmon, the grandfather salmon, pops his head out of the water, and his head's all bloody. And it's bloody because he's been hitting it against a dam that the frog people built on the river, because the frog people wanted to hoard all the water for themselves. And then the salmon couldn't spawn, right? And coyote goes through a process of tricking the frog people into allowing him access to the water, and then he punches a hole in the dam, gets the water flowing again for all the people. That tale is older than dams here, and it also says something about the cultures that it's coming from. It says something relevant to how the world uses natural resources today, and so that tale, it can be used across all cultures, and we can say, well, how does your culture deal with resources, wealth, value, different types of different classes of citizens, and how they have, and whether they have access to those resources or not. It's incredibly sophisticated, but it's an easily digestible way to present those questions and to move into synthesis. So again, cross-referencing those different brain states. We're in a meditative state when we're listening to a story. If we have to respond to questions about the story and how those reflect in our personal lives, we move into the beta and the gamma states. These are culturally curated. They represent timeless phenomenology. So those aspects of many of those aspects that are promoted in Eastern mindfulness are absolutely 100% there in the process of intentionally using Western mindfulness in this way. And to date, since we started populating YouTube with free micro lessons, 7,900 micro lessons have been accessed all over the world in different cultures all over the world. Most recently, it's the Philippines and Taiwan. So it's India is actually our biggest client using those resources on a daily basis, and we see the fluctuation in the use of those resources based on the cultural systems of school, what the school year looks like, and what access to technology looks like in other parts of the world. Those questions, if we say, well, what's an example of what those questions are able to access in terms of identifiable goals and objectives? A sample that we pulled out randomly a couple months ago had a group of students respond in a way that said, they demonstrated 91% were able to identify unethical behavior, and yet only 84 were able to identify ethical behavior. So for us, this is from a facilitator's perspective, from a mediator's perspective, I can say, all right, let's dial in why do we have that difference? Where does that come from? And how do we then address that difference and move towards a more ubiquitous understanding of what ethical behavior is versus unethical behavior. And what we find in that is maybe not an easy answer, and that's okay. That's part of the process. We also ask students to, and we'd ask this out of our adults and young children. We ask them to identify categories. So this sort of question, sort of open-ended question, is very similar to the visioning process that happens in Rotary. It's if any of your clubs have been through that, it's a fantastic process. But where you go and say, what do you need? And we do a needs assessment for a grant in a different part of the world. We're asking them to generate the categories for us rather than us prescribing what we can imagine those categories look like. When we do that, we are acting in a state of mindfulness that's intentionally providing access for everybody's voice. We do that. So we do this with the deontological questions. We do this with teleological questions, right? We purposely move into asking students, okay, identify tangible ways of building community. How can you do that here? And we can get an understanding of which students are able to synthesize at that higher level, and which are able to simply just regurgitate or respond with comprehension. Comprehension is important, but if we package questions in a certain way that creates that mindfulness, we can actually elicit synthesis. And so for helpfulness, again, we're saying we're taking the question and we're moving it back into the participant, back into the audience, and we're saying this is not about what I think is helpful. It's asking our audience to be mindful and to express the ways in which they are able to demonstrate, the ways in which they do demonstrate that in their community. That is my entire presentation. I'm happy to go back through anything or open it up to questions that anyone may have at this time. Let's stop my screen share.
Yeah. I have a question. Exactly what are the micro lessons you're referring to? And I
And
think you said
perfect.
about 7,900.
Yeah, let me go back. The last time that I had an opportunity to just mention anything about epic ethics, I think I brought, I popped into one of those micro lessons, but I'm going to do that. I'll do that for our group today. So I'm going to come back out here and here. Here's my, okay, he returns water. So we have a YouTube page, and this YouTube page has dozens of different stories that are presented on the page, and each story is built as a micro lesson. So if we start the story, it will introduce the four awesome questions
to those involved.
And then we go through the story in text form so that teachers and parents, homeschooling parents,
That's what I need to talk to you.
Adults can use this as a literacy resource if it's if that's what's intended. We have some teachers that take the resource and actually turn off the lights and allow that story to be heard and absorbed on that alpha level. We have others that use it as an active reading exercise. So you can use these resources in a lot of different ways. At the end of of each of these stories, we select a handful of different open-ended questions that are designed to engage the class or the audience in intentional discussions, right? So that are also designed so that anybody in the audience can participate in them, even audience members that may have not understood every single detail of the story. So the challenge that we have with a lot of curriculum that's produced is that it's much easier to assess comprehension data than it is open-ended synthesis data, right? And because of that, most assessments and the data that's produced is telling us whether a student understood the story or not, rather than can the student identify and synthesize the ideas that are going on within that are elicited from the story. And in some cases, the story isn't in these cases, it's not what's important. It's the dialogue that happens as a result of the ethical prompt. That's really what we want to engage in. So comprehension is great, but it's just like when kids listen to their parents at the dinner table expressing something that happened during the day. They may not understand all of the nuances of that story, but they learn a lot from watching and listening to that dialogue and that interaction. And if a group of students is going through this, then they're able to learn and digest from their classmates, from their peers, in ways that they wouldn't have if the questions were simply prescriptive and comprehension based.
Thank you.
So, Ron, these micro lessons that are available on YouTube, they're one aspect of the curriculum, right?
Yes.
That if a teacher gets the curriculum, it takes them more in depth in the whole design of the curriculum. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So these we actually developed the micro lessons as a response to the challenges with COVID.
Right.
It was never really designed to be this world forum for ethical learning. It's a beautiful thing that came out of it. So what we wanted to do was take the resources that were that are important to the curriculum, and then provide access to a certain amount of them, particularly resources that were 100% really dialed into the main social emotional learning objective. So our curriculum is a menu of many different, in fact, let me move back there. So each instructional design is a menu of several different resources. So, and those resources have links that allow the teachers, if they have access, to move out into different types of material. Sometimes they're short animations, sometimes they are other books, sometimes it's music, and understanding that the more we can utilize the different multiple intelligences, the more touches in education world, they'll say the more touches that a student has to a certain concept, the greater likelihood that they'll have to walk away with an in-depth knowledge of that. And so what we do is take the different social emotional learning objectives for each of the instructional designs, and then curate a lot of different materials that aim at different ways to access that learning. And so this is, these stories are, there's always at least one fairy tale or folktale or fable from all over the world in each of the instructional designs, but we don't limit our material, the material that we're curating to simply being that material, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And when these people access these micro lessons on YouTube, then are they directed back to the curriculum some way, so that if they want to actually adopt the curriculum, they can do that?
Exactly. Yeah. So and we even started putting the specific assessments on YouTube, like directly in the discussion or the description section on YouTube, so that teachers could try out that resource from an assessment perspective, understanding that that it may take 4 or 5 or may take a year of utilizing those lessons, and then saying, you know what, now I want activities that are going to reinforce this, more, and each of the activities are more designed as like a more traditional lesson plan sort of thing. But the concept around the way that the instructional design is presented is in this menu format of, like, today, based on my students, who's in my class today and where we're coming from, I want to choose this or this or this or this, and then move into those additional resources and activities as they digest the greater curriculum. So yeah, absolutely. They're as much for us a marketing tool as they are a resource for the world.
Yeah, and the curriculum is available for free through the Daniels Fund to students in Colorado. What if there's a teacher in India that wants to do the curriculum? How do they access it?
So they would enroll. It's $150 for a teacher right now, if they just want access to the curriculum, and they can choose their level, and they can mix and match different resources. So if what we've tried to do is aim at a $3 to $4 per pupil cost for the program. And the reason that we did that is because locally in the United States, districts and principals and counselors identify their costs for curriculum and instruction based on per pupil spending. And most resources such as this are operating in the $8 to $15 range, and that's our point isn't to compete with Pearson or McGraw-Hill. It's to really get the resources out, cover the costs that we have in producing it, continuing to produce it, and then and that $3 to $5 range, depending on how many students that a teacher's working with, is typically within the discretionary budget of principles. So for schools outside of the U.S., that's a little bit of a different story. If it's I'm working with a school in Malaysia right now, and a Rotarian there. Their budget is quite different than anyone in the U.S. And so what is more interesting to us at Epic Ethics is to work with schools like that have access to the internet, but maybe don't have access to the same funds, to say, hey, let's pilot the engagement, the relationship between Epic Ethics and that school as an intense research project that helps us collect really, really valuable data that we're not able to get locally, right? We kind of know what it looks like to deliver this program within the context of the United States or even in Central America, but in Malaysia, I'd really be interested to hear what teachers experience from delivering the program there, and then helping to build a product or to refine our product based on that experience. So in cases where schools want to really partner like that, then there is no cost for the curriculum as long as we have that relationship and that data exchange, right? The data is worth far more than the amount of money per teacher that we may get. We'll figure out how to cover our costs in a different way. So I would encourage everyone here in this forum that if you have relationships with schools outside of the United States, it's much more interesting for us to try to engage like that. It's much more rich and beneficial for all concerned if we're able to make that happen.
Any other questions? And one more question, if you can be brief, we're running close. Do you do anything directly with mindfulness with the students, and what results have you seen, and what technique? How do you do it in 12 words or less?
Yeah, absolutely. The place that you see mindfulness in particular happen within the curriculum is starts with gratitude, right? So we have specific aspects of the curriculum that aim at gratitude. Gratitude is a place that cross-references that, and it builds in that reciprocal nature of moving it slowly moving it off off what do I get out of the world to what do other people receive from me. And that's what we kind of work towards, is that reciprocal nature of gift giving. The idea that we're only here because of a lot of other people that exist here right now and our ancestors. So we move back into that an indigenous wisdom sort of perspective, and ask students to elicit those feelings and responses within themselves. If you're asking, does the program ask students specifically to meditate? We do have breathing exercises that are included in the program. We have our own version of Think Before You Act, that asks kids to pause for 3 seconds before they say something, and we build towards those skills in an intentional way from early childhood through our 6th grade curriculum. So this year we're building out the ECE part of it, the 3s and 4s, 4s to 5s, and then next year, 2022, 2023, we'll be building out middle school programs that will actually bring in a lot of restorative justice techniques, into how into allowing the teacher to build and piece together a conflict resolution regimes in their class that make sense, that are relevant to their and differentiated for their students.
As I hear you talk tonight, I keep wondering how different my life might have been had I had your class back when you're teaching them. Thank you. Very, very exciting, very pleasing. I've heard a lot of talks on meditation. Yours was exceptional, and I appreciate what you're doing. And hopefully we can find a way, each of us can find a way to help you get into more schools, get into more youth, and embrace the ideas within our own lives. I still hope I'm learning and growing. So we thank you very, very much, Ron, for being with us tonight and sharing.
Thank you so much.
So thank you. So next week, we're going to get truly challenged. We're bringing in a lady by the name of Helen Peacock from Canada, who is, well, I'll just read just a little bit of this. Helen Peacock will be speaking to share an inspiring idea that Rotarians could not only be leaders in building positive peace around the world, they could also be leaders in ending the use of war as a way to resolve conflict. In her presentations, Helen directly addresses the old argument that Rotary can't be political and encourage us instead to recognize our potential to even be more impactfully shift our planet to peace. In just the last few months, clubs over 40 districts have responded to her call in action. Into our own committee, I'll be sending out a 30-minute program that she does that's quite phenomenal. It will be challenging, it will be thought-provoking. I came across her at a peace conference only because of the title of her speech, which is something I've been thinking and talking about. Can Rotary be the tipping point to bring peace and to end war? Is Rotary now preparing ourselves to be in that position to be the tipping point? Food for thought. Thank you all very much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Ron, again, we thank you very much for some tremendous material.